They thought they had finally gotten away with it, but they were deeply wrong. Explore the cold, hard, and unforgiving truth of vengeance as we tell the stories that others are afraid to mention. Hit that subscribe button for more unfiltered and raw content.
The morning they let me go, I had a blueberry muffin sitting on my desk that I hadn't touched yet. That's the detail that stays with me. Not the conference room with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Not the 12 faces arranged around the mahogany table, half of them people I'd trained myself. The muffin, still in its paper wrapper, still warm. My mother-in-law had brought it for me that morning when she stopped by the hospital on her way to a board meeting. She set it next to my keyboard and said, "You look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday." She wasn't wrong. I'd been at Whitmore Medical Center for 9 years. Chief Operating Officer for the last 3. I came in as a department coordinator when I was 28, right after my husband and I got married, and I worked my way up through every unglamorous position this place had. Patient services, billing disputes, facilities management, the kind of roles that nobody wants and everybody needs. By the time I was 35, I knew this hospital the way you know the layout of a house you grew up in. I knew which supply closet had a broken latch on the 3rd floor. I knew that the overnight security guard on the East Wing, a man named Theodore, took his break at 2047 a.m. every night without fail. I knew the rhythm of this place. My husband's father owned it. I want to be careful here, because when I tell this story, people sometimes assume I got where I was because of who I married. I understand why they think that. But I was hired 2 years before I started dating my husband, by a department head who had no idea whose daughter-in-law I would eventually become. The promotion to COO came after I restructured the entire intake system and cut patient wait times by 31% in 14 months. Those are numbers that speak for themselves. His father, though, the man who founded Whitmore, who built it from a single urgent care clinic in 1987 into a 4-facility network. He never fully saw me as anything other than his son's wife who happened to work for him. He was cordial. He was even occasionally warm. But there was always a ceiling in his eyes when he looked at me, and I could feel it. His daughter didn't work there. She had her own life, her own career in real estate. And we got along fine. This was never about her. This was about my brother-in-law. My husband's younger brother Felix joined Whitmore 18 months before everything fell apart. He had an MBA, a confident handshake, and exactly 0 healthcare experience. His father brought him in as VP of Strategic Development, which was a title that had been invented specifically for him, and which overlapped with almost everything my department did. The first few months I tried to make it work. I scheduled alignment meetings. I put together briefing documents so he could get up to speed. I introduced him to the department heads, walked him through ongoing initiatives, made him look competent in rooms where he wasn't. I did this because he was family. I did it because he was family. I did it because my husband asked me to. I did it because I genuinely believed, at the time, that it was the right thing to do. What I didn't understand yet was that Felix was paying close attention to everything I showed him, not to learn, but to repackage. The first time I noticed it clearly was during the Q3 board presentation. I had spent 6 weeks developing a proposal for a new care coordination program. The kind of cross-departmental initiative that requires knowing every corner of the hospital's operations. Felix had sat in on 2 of my planning sessions. When the board meeting came, he presented my proposal. Not a version of it, not an inspired by version. My proposal, with his name on the cover slide. I raised it with my father-in-law afterward. Privately, professionally. I brought documentation, emails, dated drafts, meeting notes. He listened. He nodded, then he said, "Felix may have presented it, but these things are collaborative. That's how good teams work." I went home that evening and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. My husband was sympathetic, but he had a complicated relationship with his own family, the kind that had calcified over decades, and he didn't push back. He said, "Maybe just give it time." I loved him. I gave it time. 6 more months passed. Felix got credit for the care coordination rollout when it succeeded. He got credit for the vendor renegotiation that my team spent 4 months executing. At a hospital-wide leadership retreat, he was introduced as the architect of Whitmore's operational turnaround, while I sat 3 seats down the table and smiled the way you smile when you've practiced it enough that it doesn't reach your eyes anymore. What kept me going, honestly, was my team. I had 31 people in my division. Some of them had been at Whitmore longer than I had. My director of patient services, a woman named Augusta, had started as a floor nurse in 1998. My facilities manager, a quiet man named Roland, knew the physical infrastructure of every Whitmore building better than the contractors who built them. There was Simone, my logistics coordinator, who could untangle a supply chain disaster at 6 a.m. on no sleep and still be coherent enough to brief the medical staff. And there was Petra, my deputy COO, who had turned down a position at a hospital in Atlanta to stay on my team. They knew what was happening. They saw it. We didn't talk about it directly. That's not how professional relationships work. But there was an understanding. The kind of understanding that doesn't need words. The call came on a Thursday morning in March. My father-in-law's assistant reached me at 8:15 and said there was an urgent meeting with the executive board at 9:01, conference room B, the big one on the 6th floor. No agenda provided. I assumed it was about the new facility we'd been planning in Evanston. There had been some zoning complications, and I'd been managing the legal response. I stopped by my office first. That's when my mother-in-law appeared with the muffin. She had a board seat, an honorary one that had been mostly ceremonial for years, but lately she'd been attending more meetings, asking more questions. There had been tension at family dinners that everyone pretended not to notice. She set the muffin on my desk and looked at me for a moment longer than the gesture required. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "A little tired," I said. "Big meeting this morning." She nodded slowly. "Yes." She said it in a way that made me want to ask a follow-up question. But her phone rang and she stepped out into the hallway, and I thought, I'll ask her after. I didn't eat the muffin. I picked up my notebook and went upstairs. The conference room was already full when I arrived, all 12 board members. My father-in-law at the head of the table, Felix to his right, which was unusual. Our general counsel, a man named Walter, standing near the window instead of sitting, which I had never seen before. I took my usual seat. My father-in-law didn't do a long preamble. That wasn't his style. He said, "We've made a decision to restructure the COO position. Effective today, the role will be absorbed into strategic development under Felix's leadership. We appreciate everything you've contributed to Whitmore, and we'd like to offer a generous severance package. I'll have Walter walk you through the details." He said it in about 20 seconds. I remember the specific quality of the silence that followed. Not empty, dense, like something had been compressed into it. I looked at my father-in-law. He was looking at a spot slightly above my head. I looked at Felix. He was looking at his hands. I looked at Walter, the general counsel, and this is the thing I want you to understand. Walter was pale. Not uncomfortable pale. Actually, medically pale. He was gripping a folder in both hands, and he was not looking at me, and he was not looking at my father-in-law, and his jaw was doing something I can only describe as controlled panic. "I see," I said. My voice was completely steady. "I don't know how. My grandmother used to say that certain women are made with a cold room inside them, a place you can retreat to when everything outside is on fire." I had never fully understood what she meant until that moment. "I'll need a few minutes to gather my things," I said. My father-in-law nodded. "Of course. We can give you until 10:45 minutes to clear 9 years." I stood up. I picked up my notebook. I said, "Thank you." And I meant it in a way that I don't think anyone in that room understood, because I was thanking the situation for clarifying itself. I walked out of conference room B and into the hallway, and I stood at the elevator for a moment, and I thought about the muffin on my desk. I went down to my office and I started packing. My deputy Petra was already at her desk when I came in. She took one look at my face. I wasn't crying, I was completely calm, but something in my expression must have communicated itself. And she stood up. "What happened?" "They're restructuring the COO position," I said. "It goes to Felix. I've got until 10. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Okay." And she started helping me pack. Word travels fast in hospitals. I don't know who saw what, or who said what to whom in what corridor. But by 9:35, people started appearing in the doorway of my office. Augusta from patient services, Roland from facilities, Simone with a cardboard box she'd found somewhere. Others. Nobody made a speech. Nobody gave me the kind of sympathy that makes you feel worse. They just showed up. They helped me find my phone charger, which had fallen behind the radiator. They racked my framed photos and printer paper so they wouldn't get scratched. They stood in my office and they were present in the way that matters when everything else is collapsing. At 9:52, I picked up my box. I picked up the muffin. I walked out of my office and toward the elevator bank. I heard the footsteps before I turned around. Petra. Then Augusta. Then Roland. Then Simone. One after another in a line, carrying their own things. I stopped walking. "What are you doing?" I asked. Petra said, "We tendered our resignations 8 minutes ago." I looked at the line behind her. I counted. Not because I needed the number, but because I needed something to do with my brain in that moment. 18 people. My entire senior team plus 7 others. "You can't." I started. "We can," Augusta said. She said it the way she said everything, matter of fact, no embellishment, completely final. We took 2 elevator trips to the lobby. The security guard at the front desk, a young man named Curtis who had worked the morning shift for 3 years, looked up when we came through. He looked at the boxes. He looked at the line of people. He looked at me. He said, "Have a good day, Dr. Calloway." I'm not a doctor. He'd called me that as a running joke for 2 years, ever since I'd helped him navigate a billing dispute with his own insurance. I managed not to cry right there in the lobby, which I'm still proud of. We stood on the sidewalk outside Whitmore Medical Center on a gray March morning, 18 people with their things in boxes, and for a moment nobody said anything. Then Simone said, "There's a coffee place on Wacker. I think we should go." So we went. What I didn't know yet, what I was about to find out over the next 72 hours, was why Walter had been standing by the window looking like a man who'd just been informed of a structural problem with the building he was standing in. I found out through my mother-in-law, who called me that evening. She had left the board meeting before it ended. She called me from her car and she said, without preamble, "They didn't tell you about the Meridian contract, did they?" It wasn't a question. I said, "What about the Meridian contract?" The Meridian contract was a 3-year service agreement with a large insurance network that covered roughly 40% of Whitmore's revenue. It was one of the most significant contracts the hospital had. I had personally managed the renewal negotiation 8 months prior, 18 months of groundwork, relationship maintenance, 3 rounds of revision, a final meeting in their offices where I had sat across from their VP of Network Partnerships for 4 hours. The contract had a standard clause but one I had insisted on including and which their team had agreed to. A key personnel clause. If specific individuals listed by name left Whitmore, voluntarily or otherwise, the insurance network had the right to renegotiate terms or exit the agreement. My name was on that list. My father-in-law had signed the contract. He had signed it 8 months ago. I cannot tell you whether he read that specific clause carefully, or whether his attention had been elsewhere, or whether he simply hadn't imagined, at the time, that he would ever be in a position to fire me. What I can tell you is that by 9:15 that Thursday morning when he was delivering his 20-second speech about restructuring, the Meridian Network's legal team had already been notified of my departure by their own internal contact at Whitmore. They had sent notice of intent to renegotiate before noon. Walter, the general counsel, had found out at 9:45, which explained the pallor. My mother-in-law had found out at 11 when she got a call from a board member who thought she already knew. She didn't already know. The phone call she made to me that evening was the longest conversation we had ever had. She said things she had clearly been holding for a long time, things about her husband, about Felix, about patterns she'd watched develop over years and hadn't said enough about. She also told me that 2 of Whitmore's department heads, physicians who had been at the hospital since before I arrived, had sent letters to the board that afternoon indicating that they would be seeking positions elsewhere if the leadership changes were not reconsidered. She said, "I think you should get a lawyer." I already had one. I had called her from the coffee place on Wacker at 11 that morning while everyone else was ordering. I am not going to tell you that everything that came next was easy because it wasn't. There were several weeks that were genuinely hard, not emotionally. I had more clarity in those weeks than I'd had in 2 years, but logistically. 18 people had left jobs. Some of them had mortgages, some of them had families. I took that seriously. What I will tell you is that the Meridian situation moved quickly. Their VP of Network Partnerships had worked with me directly for over a year. 2 days after my departure, she called me personally, not my former employer, not the board, me, and asked if I had any plans. I had been working on a plan since approximately 10:15 on the morning I was fired. Petra had been part of that conversation. So had Roland, who had already identified 3 facilities in the metro area with available square footage and operational infrastructure. So had Augusta, who had quietly been reaching out to her network in hospital administration for the past year, not because she had anticipated this specific outcome, but because she was Augusta, and Augusta always knew what was coming before anyone else did. We incorporated 9 weeks after I left Whitmore. The name was Harrogate Health Partners. We opened the first facility in May. Meridian came on as our founding network partner. By October, we had a second facility under contract and a staffing base of 62 people, most of whom had come to us. We hadn't recruited them. I won't say what happened to Whitmore, because this story isn't about them. What I will say is that the Evanston facility that had been in planning when I left was still in planning 18 months later. My mother-in-law joined our advisory board in the fall. She brought 2 colleagues with her and a contact list that would have taken me years to build on my own. We had lunch every Thursday for a while. She always brought something. Usually muffins. My husband and I went through a hard stretch that year. I won't minimize it. When your professional life and your family life are entangled the way ours were, a rupture in one place sends fractures everywhere. We had long conversations. We had some shorter, sharper ones. He made choices I hadn't expected, including a phone call to his father in November that I was not present for, but which I know happened and which changed something between them that hasn't fully healed. He came home that evening and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "I should have made that call a lot earlier. I'm sorry." I poured him a glass of wine and we sat there for a while without talking, which is sometimes the most honest thing 2 people can do. There's something I've thought about a lot in the years since, which is the question of what loyalty actually is. Not loyalty as an abstract value. I don't find those conversations very useful. Loyalty as a practice, as a daily choice. When Augusta walked out of that building with a box of her things, she had been at Whitmore for 23 years. 23 years. She had more tenure there than anyone except the founders. She didn't hesitate. I asked her about it later. We were having dinner, the 2 of us, at a place near the new facility. I asked her when she decided. She said, "When you walked out of the conference room, I was at my desk and I heard your elevator go down and I thought, if she leaves this building alone, that's not something I'm able to do." I didn't have a good response to that. I still don't. What I know is that she didn't do it for me. She did it because of what she believed about how people should be treated, and that's a different thing. People who act from principle rather than loyalty are actually more reliable, because the principle doesn't change based on circumstances. Augusta would have done that for anyone she'd watched be treated the way I'd been treated. That is the kind of person you want in your organization. That is the kind of person you build something real with. The last thing I want to say is something about the muffin. I ate it on the sidewalk outside Whitmore, while we were all standing there in the gray March air, waiting to figure out what to do next. It was still a little warm. My mother-in-law had gotten them from a bakery on Oak Street that she'd been going to since before I met her husband. It was a good muffin. Simone looked at me eating it and said, "Did you seriously bring a muffin?" I said, "Someone was going to eat it." And then we all went and got coffee and we started figuring out what came next. I've thought a lot about what actually caused everything that happened, not the firing itself. That was just an event, a morning, 45 minutes and a cardboard box. I mean the whole chain of it. Why things unraveled the way they did, why the people who thought they were winning ended up holding nothing, why 18 people I had never asked for anything walked out of a building they'd spent years inside. I don't think it was luck, and I don't think it was justice in any cosmic sense. I'm too practical for that framing. What I think it was is consequence. Plain, unhurried, inevitable consequence. Felix spent 18 months taking. He took credit for the care coordination program. He took the vendor renegotiation. He took the narrative at the leadership retreat. And every time he took something, he got a little less capable of doing anything on his own, because the muscle you don't use stops working. By the time he was handed the COO role, he had no idea what it actually required. He had watched me do it without ever understanding what he was watching. That's not a character flaw I'm condemning. It's just what happens when you spend your energy acquiring instead of building. You end up with a title and no foundation under it. My father-in-law made a different kind of mistake. He confused loyalty with compliance. He thought that because I had been professional, because I had managed his son's inheritance of a company with care and without complaint, that I would absorb this too, that I would accept a restructuring that erased 9 years and smile at family dinners afterward. He had mistaken my patience for passivity. Those are not the same thing. What I learned, and I mean really learned, not the version you say at a panel and then forget, is that integrity is not a strategy. I didn't behave the way I behaved because I was calculating a future payoff. I didn't document my work because I anticipated needing evidence. I didn't build relationships with a Meridian team because I was planning an exit. I did those things because they were the right way to do the work. And when everything broke open, all of that just was already there. The clause in the contract, the relationships that transferred, the Teolite knew what I was actually worth because they had watched me work for years. Augusta didn't walk out of that building because she had calculated the odds. She walked out because she'd watched me behave with integrity for 9 years, and she wasn't willing to be part of an organization that discarded that. Petra didn't resign because she thought Harrogate would succeed. She resigned because her own standards wouldn't let her do otherwise. What I had built, without ever meaning to build it strategically, was a reputation that other people were willing to stake something on. That's the thing I want to hold on to. Not the outcome. The outcome was good, and I'm grateful, but outcomes are never guaranteed. What I want to hold on to is the fact that the only thing I had in my hands when I walked out of that conference room was 9 years of doing the work honestly. No leverage, no plan, just a track record and a team that knew it. It turned out that was enough. It's almost always enough if you give it time.